hungry people. Ever seen them? If you haven't, it's a shame on the world that we are not able to feed them. We waste millions of tons of grains globally. Ending global poverty still remains a distant dream for the world. Poverty knocked the doors of more than 689 million people globally. Poverty entails more than the lack of income and productive resources to ensure sustainable livelihoods. Its manifestations include hunger and malnutrition, limited access to education and other basic services like social discrimination and exclusion, along with the lack of participation in decision making. When the world was finally making a stride in overcoming global poverty, novel coronavirus attacked humanity. Since 1990, more than 1.2 billion people have risen out of extreme poverty, but in the year 2020, everything has taken a reverse gear. COVID-19 pandemic has threatened humanity in all possible ways. Decades of progress in the fight against global poverty and income inequality has all taken many steps backwards. It has jeopardized the lives and future of generations to come. Factor this, 9.2% of the world population is in a miserable condition. They survive on $1.9 a day or less. The poverty rate for children is twice as high as for adults. According to the World Bank, an additional 88 million to 115 million people will fall into extreme poverty by the end of 2020, with the total rising of 150 million by 2021. According to a report by the United Nations, COVID-19 pandemic could push over 1 billion people into extreme poverty by 2030. The high damage scenario anticipates that 80% of the COVID-induced economic crisis would persist in 10 years' time due to loss in productivity. A focused set of sustainable development goals, investments in social protection, welfare programs, governance, and above all, implementation of the proper plans needs to be ensured, as it is the only way out. The rise of extreme poverty is a sign of a weak nation. The pandemic has brought up the well-curtailed truth on the face of the governments and the nation. World's vision might be committed to ending poverty, but it requires the global leaders to be on the same page. New Delhi Bureau, Democracy News Live.
Welcome to Democracy News Live. Even seeing children suffer, seeing that so many of them don't have food to eat, and one thinks, what's the point of creating and calling ourselves a civilization if we can't provide the population food, we can't give them shelter, we can't give them education? You're better off calling yourselves scavengers still. 2030 is a date set up as a goal when poverty would have been eradicated. That goal seems like it will not be met now. It will be much further away. Now, it's not as if things cannot be done, steps cannot be taken. Absolutely they can. And that's what we are here to discuss today. We have on our show two guests, both of them very connected to where we stand today. Let me introduce Ranu Bhogal. She's the director of Oxfam India, has been working in the development sector for about 30 years. She joins us on the show. Also joining us is Clint Borgen. He's the founder and president of the Borgen project. He's widely regarded as one of the leading poverty reduction campaigners in the United States. Let me come to you, Ranu, first. Where do you think and how badly do you think the whole poverty goal of 2032, eradicate it, has been pushed back with the pandemic?
Well, it has been pushed back. I mean, the latest reports that you see from IMF, the World Bank, the UNDP, the multidimensional poverty report that they have brought out, the 10 years stock taking. The pandemic has pushed all the countries, majority of countries who were on track in terms of achieving the goal of reducing poverty and actually eliminating poverty by 2030. They've taken a huge beating. And I think I have read somewhere that we have probably gone back by up to 9 years in some countries. So, that goal has been pushed further away from us. So the pandemic has impacted the countries, and especially countries like India, where, the reports are that some 40 million people lost their jobs. There's huge crisis that's looming in our country.
When you look around India, a lot of people, especially, I'm sorry to say this, but people like us who are unimpacted at many, many levels beyond, certain areas of our lives by the pandemic. But then there are so many more out there who don't have jobs. There has been reduction of pays, salaries, full-time work is all gone out of the window. Students, people have been massively impacted. Let me bring in Clint here. Clint, explain to me, as you sit in the United States and watch the numbers around the world, and what you do there is kind of look at the rest of the world and see what US's awareness is around it, I guess. Explain to me, is there that awareness that the world has to pull together in this and get people out of poverty? And if that's that, then what would it take?
I think that the awareness is definitely there. What's going to be challenging is whether or not we're going to find the global resources to do it. So it's one thing to be aware that a global pandemic takes a global response, but it's another thing when, at least I can say domestically in the United States here, whether or not Congress or the White House are willing to allocate funding overseas that might otherwise be going to funding our own COVID challenges here. So that's going to be the big test of all countries, really, is how much we're willing to put our resources towards this global pandemic, as opposed to focus inward on our each country's own challenges.
And today, tell me, what is that which needs to be met first, and how do we achieve that? Where can the world now saying, okay, we need to do this first to pull people away from poverty, because we know there are a tremendous amount of people who are going hungry?
Yeah, I mean, the big one is just get the virus under control, because a lot of the factors that's creating the poverty right now is people can't work because of the virus. So whether it's a person trying to sell stuff in the local market or go down the list, but if people aren't able to actually earn an income, that's where the poverty is really kicking in. So, but in order to get those wheels turning, obviously we have to address the pandemic. So number one is address the pandemic. Number two is start to rebuild job opportunities and economic opportunities. The one thing I do want to point out is, the world has done a great job in recent years of drastically reducing poverty. We've seen poverty rates drop pretty substantially. So this is where it's kind of got a lot of us rattled, is, after years of seeing poverty decline, definitely hasn't occurred at the pace I'd like to see happen, but it has been occurring. All of a sudden COVID hit and we're like, oh my goodness, like it's just such a shock to the system after all these years of seeing things start to go in the right direction. And, there's a lot of great solutions for addressing these problems. A lot of great experts. You have one of them on your show right now out here from Oxfam. Renu's doing great work out there. So there's organizations like that on the ground that really know what they're doing and are having a huge impact. But yeah, the COVID, it's a real threat to reversing some of the progress, and we're hoping it's a short-term reversal and things will get back in the swing.
I was talking to the managing director of Vaccine International, and what he told me, this was a week ago, we were doing a show around vaccines. He said by the time countries like India and the population in India will get it, we will be looking at 2023, 2024, because it's a long haul here. People may think, oh my God, it's just two vaccines, 2 doses, we'll get it pretty quickly. But that whole cycle of how it needs to travel, when it needs to travel, what doses need to be given to people. If you're looking at 2023, 2024, by the time the pandemic begins to recede at the level we require, or even let's say 2022, we reduce, deaths dramatically, how much of an impact that will make?
Yeah, in terms of so in the short term, it's going to be a lot of pain for sure. The one positive is we are getting, even the simple stuff like wearing masks, we are getting a better sense of some things we can do to slow the spread. But yeah, it's going to be definitely not. We won't see it solved this year or likely next in terms of the economic impact it's having on the world's poor.
Ranu, if you can kind of weigh in on this as well. You already have seen what the impact of, the lack of employment has been on poverty itself. Uh, if you if you're told today that it's still 2 years away that the poor are going to get the vaccine, then what is the kind of impact do you think on the ground it's going to make? How far are they going to get pushed?
So I want to bring in, that Oxfam works on inequality. And all our studies, all our work shows that there are huge inequalities in access to health services in general. So even accessing a vaccine, which is, well, still not yet there, but it's not going to be cheap. And I although our government keeps claiming that it will give it free to the poor, I mean, we have a huge population to cater to. People have no choice. People are already out there working. I mean, you look at the conditions in which people live. In India, 90% of active workers are in what we call the informal sector. And I'm not counting the well of informal sector workers, the consultants and architects and doctors, but we are really looking at the street vendors, the all the gig workers, and they have no options because they work literally hand to mouth, daily wages. They have already started working and they are taking all the risks. So there is this debate between lives and livelihoods, and people are saying that, before we die of the virus, we'll die of hunger. So they are already out there working. Of course, there has been huge job loss. And so even in the informal sector, because the economy was anyway slowing down even before the pandemic, as far as India is concerned. And now with the pandemic, the demand has gone down. So, everything has got impacted. Our big construction sector, manufacturing sector, services sector, everything has got impacted. Women have taken a huge hit. Women workers have lost jobs. And so it's not such a straightforward thing that by 2023 everybody will get the vaccine and everything will be hunky-dory. Even today, we do not have 100%, or even if we say it's a herd immunity or 70-75% coverage of the COVID vaccine will happen, I doubt it very much. So, I think the government in India will have to invest much more in the public health care system, the infrastructure. The investment in our public healthcare system is very poor. It's less than 1% of the gross domestic product of the country, while the demand has been 3% for a very long time. So, most people anyway depend on private healthcare providers. Their out-of-pocket expenses on accessing health services are in the range of 60% of the health services they access, which is huge burden on people. And as a result, people, and especially women and girls, get neglected. So it's a complex story. So I think people who have to eat have to work, and they have to get out there and take all the risks. It's only people like you and me who can sit and do this work from home and remote working and all that. That option is not available to 90% of the workers in this country. So
That's so true.
I'm
Ranu,
not sure if I've answered your question, but that's
no,
the
no,
real. Yeah.
you've given me a good overview. Ranu, I want to even ask you because you obviously work a lot with children as well. Uh, a large part of the poverty-stricken population is children. Now, how poorly or how badly are their rights going to get impacted with them being pushed further into poverty, if I want to say that, I want to call it that?
Very badly. Because, see, to get out of the cycle of poverty, education is one way to, break that barrier. You get educated, you acquire skills, and you are able to then up your kind of game and move out of, say, the agriculture or, low paid job kind of a cycle. And what the COVID crisis has done is that education has taken a big hit. So, everybody has moved to so-called online education. And in our country, the penetration of internet is not very good. And a large majority of children belong to what we call the more marginalized groups of the scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, what we call in India. These are more marginalized sections of the society who do not have access to smartphones and computers and electricity and internet. So there's been huge dropout of children. Again, here too, girls have got impacted even far more. So wherever families have managed to organize a smartphone and allow access to their children, it's the boys who get the privilege. So girls are dropping out, and schools are closed. And what we are hearing is, and all the studies are showing, that even when the schools open, the likelihood of a lot of these children coming back to school is very low. Many of them are turning to child labor. There's also increased trafficking of children and early forced marriages of young girls. So, again, as I said, this is a complex web of things that has unleashed as far as children of India are concerned. So a terrible state of affairs, and this is not going to repair very fast. And with digital divide as it exists in this country, the likelihood of the children, hoping for a better future has receded. Yeah.
And they've been pushed back. Tell me a bit about your project, Clint. What is the Borgen project, and how does it work with the global community?
So we're based in the U.S. and we're about 17 years old now. And I launched it shortly after college. I'd spent time over in Kosovo when that war of ethnic cleansing was going on over there, and just saw a need for an organization that could put pressure on U.S. leaders and try to get them doing more with the U.S. foreign policy to address global poverty and development concerns. So what we do is we basically operate at the political level. We go and meet directly with members of Congress and their staff, and we mobilize people across the country. We have volunteers in about 700 cities throughout the U.S. And really just kind of put pressure on U.S. leaders to make sure they're doing more to address global poverty than they might otherwise would. And that can take the form of everything from identifying certain legislation like the Water for the World Act, which we worked on, and helping get those passed in Congress. Global Food Security Act is another one fairly recently we worked on. So it's really just about getting legislation through Congress and getting pressure on U.S. leaders to try to get our foreign policy more focused on improving the human condition than it currently is. Right? I think it's fairly accurate to say right now the U.S. foreign policy is primarily focused around military endeavors, and we're trying to get a lot more focus and funding going towards the humanitarian side of some of the world challenges.
Clint, with the change in administration and the new president-elect being in place, do you see that the United States is going to turn back to focusing a bit around global poverty and still trying to be a global leader again?
I think so. When Joe Biden was in the Senate, he served on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, and he's definitely an individual very engaged in the world and global development and diplomacy and poverty as well. So we're very hopeful that it's going to be a pretty strong administration when it comes to tackling poverty.
When it comes to Ranu, when we look at the administration on the Indian side and we see how they are addressing poverty, do you see them making the effort? Right now we've been seeing protest after protest, and in fact an already stressed nation with already stressed people going through more stress, and that also rural India getting into stress. That is the last thing anybody expected, where farmers will have to be encircling India's capital, New Delhi.
Yeah. Yes. See, I think the development model, and it's not just the present government in power, even the previous government, I think the model is something that they believe that more industry and incentivizing the corporate sector is the only way to push the gross domestic product and economic growth in our country. I think they keep forgetting that 80% of India still lives in rural India, and a large majority of them still depend on agriculture and subsistence agriculture, and to some extent, of course, market-based kind of. The agriculture is their livelihood, so to say. So obviously the farmers, these laws that have been passed recently, and they were passed during the pandemic with no discussion, no consultation, and that's the anger of the farmers, and that's where they're sitting and agitating in the capital. Uh, uh, Again, the issue is not very straightforward about giving them an assured price for their produce. The laws are also opening up the opportunity for corporate, what the farmers perceive as a corporate takeover of farming. And they give the examples of the United States and European countries where large scale, corporates take on farming, and it's mechanized and better quality seed and inputs. But the experience of farmers to contract farming, for instance, which is one of the laws that has been passed, has not been very good. And as I use the word subsistence agriculture, food security is closely linked to what farmers grow. So they don't grow only for the market, they also grow for consumption and their local markets. So, the laws that have been passed in a hurry. Of course, the previous government was also, debating about these laws. What the farmers are saying is that you should have consulted us. We should have a full parliament session. Let's discuss the pros and cons of each of these provisions, and then take decisions around it. Because, as I said, we are an agrarian, still an agriculture dependent predominantly economy, and there is subsistence agriculture, and you can't suddenly start making them unviable and push them out of agriculture. We have done that in the past with many development projects where people have been forced to, have been dispossessed of their lands and then forced to come to cities and work as casual wage workers. And you've seen those images when the lockdown was announced in March of people marching back home because they had absolutely nothing to live on in cities. So because the trains and buses and everything had stopped, they walked back hundreds of kilometers because that's where they felt that they would at least get food and shelter. So, we are a large country. We are complicated. We can't have these kind of sudden passing of laws and expecting people to fall in line. So it is. And similarly,
it'll possibly pull and push a lot of marginalized farmers, the small farmers, into poverty. And that's one of the worries I think a lot of people have. Let me address one more thing. Clint, one of the challenges around poverty, if you look at poverty, almost 50% of the people who are stuck in poverty are in sub-Saharan Africa, out of just 5 countries. The second bit of it, over 40% of the people who are in poverty are in some ways stuck with fragility of nations, whether it's conflict or issues. Then beyond that, about 130 million people live in places which are high flood risk places. These 3 factors of poverty are beyond what we see today around the pandemic. Now, is there like a global initiative to address these 3 issues separately? And what's the goal?
Yeah, that's, some of it gets into play through the sustainability goals, but you bring up a really good point, and that is the how do you want to say, the birth lottery is a term you also often hear. But I mean, if you're born in a country that is A, in the conflict, or B, has issues with flooding, or a region of the world that has issues with flooding, your life is going to be drastically different than the rest of ours in a much harsher way. And climate change is another factor coming in, and that's part of the flooding factor too, is we're seeing increased flooding in a lot of these regions due to climate change and other issues. Along with climate change, you're also seeing issues with crops not doing well that in the past would have done fine in that same region too. So it's a big issue, but you're absolutely right. Like there's just factors outside of our day-to-day existence that if you live in certain regions that have those issues, you are going to have a lot of challenges and struggling in life. And if you're born in the regions that don't have those issues, you're going to have a lot better success rate, a lot better chance of survival.
Ranu, is there a strategy around this and how we'll address these three areas? Because whatever I've seen, I've traveled a fair bit in my life. I haven't, people have talked about it. I spent many, years in Bangladesh covering the floods, and then beyond that, working on what is it to live with water. I haven't seen enough effort being made globally for saying, all right, this is a problem, and this is how we deal with it, and pull a lot of people out of poverty. Is there a strat around it? Is there a way that we'll have to get over it? If there is a conflict-ridden zone, how do we resolve the conflict? Does the world come together?
So, we all were relieved with the US election results because the direction in which the country was moving, and globally, obviously other leaders were also following suit, so to say. And one of the areas that was of deep concern to many of us was the climate issue, and this whole denial that there is a climate crisis and we need to do something about it. So we are hoping that climate resilience, climate financing is something globally will be given attention to, because a lot of people still depend on land, on water, the fisheries and horticulture and agriculture, and so land-based and natural resource-based livelihoods are huge in Africa. You mentioned sub-Saharan Africa, and I know India and Bangladesh. So I'm hoping that there'll be greater attention to climate financing, climate resilience. You also mentioned, I would mention, the increased incidence of climate shocks and environmental shocks that are happening, more cyclones, floods, earthquakes. So, building resilient communities in these vulnerable geographies is also something that needs to be given priority. You have rising sea levels, and many countries and cities are going to disappear in the next 20, 30 years. So needs attention. I think health financing is another area that needs serious attention because of the COVID crisis. Particularly, it has shown the weak health infrastructure can really put us back so badly. So I do feel that there is, of course, a lot of debate around free vaccine and who's going to fund this. So, again, I think it should be a global priority because it's a pandemic. And it's not confined to one nation, or it doesn't know boundaries. I mean, everything has come to a halt. So I think free vaccine is another thing that probably the global leaders must agree upon. Otherwise, the rich nations will take all the vaccines and the poor will be left with nothing. So that's another area. And I do feel that education and skill building, that's another area, because I am seeing in our country how the digital divide is impacting education. It is a third area that I believe needs, and of course, job creation, employment generation, investing.
I think skill development is directly connected, Ranu. I think what the challenge is, it's not as if jobs don't exist, just that the skills don't exist to be able to deliver.
It's unemployable. Unemployable workforce is what we call.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. So what we are seeing, and thank you, Ranu, and thank you, Clint, for joining me for talking about this, because what we're seeing is a global response that's required. Everybody is looking at what's happening and knows that the challenge is going to exist, where the world is not going to meet its goals. The world will talk about it, but will never really come together around it. But it's required. You cannot have such a large part of your population living in abject poverty while others enjoy the world, food, shelter, education, culture, and you leave so many people behind. If the pandemic is going to continuously push even more people in poverty, we're looking at a larger global challenge. So thank you for joining me again, Ranu. Thank you for joining me, Clint, for the show. And I think we, as a global community, need to continue working together on it. Thank you. Good night and good luck.